Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our panel discussion on the implications of grey listing for South African mining companies. My name is Richard MacDonald from Digby Wells Environmental. Joining me on the panel today, from my right, is Bert Lopes, Natural Resources Partner from BDO Johannesburg, Michael Denenga, a partner in the investment funds team at Webber Wentzel, Anne Lepile, CEO of Alex Forbes Investments, Sarah Cooper, Sustainability Executive from Digby Wells Environmental, and Jason Arell, Founding Partner at BLC Robert Mauritius. Despite South Africa's efforts to address shortcomings identified by the Financial Action Task Force, there's a significant possibility that these were implemented too late and don't address the risks highlighted. This leaves a real risk that grey listing status will apply to South Africa in the near future. And from an investment point of view, is ESG currently being considered in the investment decision-making processes, and are funds being monitored against it?
So, good morning, everybody. So, I mean, in our minds, if you are not considering ESG, you are half a fund manager. So, the consideration of the risk implications of environmental, social, and governance factors in everything you do should form part of your investment process. So I think maybe the key going forward is to actually evidence that you are considering it. But whether it's been considered or not, I think is really a fait accompli. It's been done all the time.
Perfect. Sarah, what are the current ESG market trends affecting mining clients today?
Thanks, Richard. So what I'd say is mainstreaming and consolidation of disclosure frameworks. Beyond that, as Anne just alluded to, sort of an expectation of action. You can't just say what you're doing, you have to be showing it. In terms of themes, climate continues to be loud, water disclosure, biodiversity, and then social. And also, it's not just thinking about these things in silos, but integrating that thinking and showing how they link together.
I suppose maybe getting to the topic at hand, what is grey listing, and when do we think it's going to hit us? What can we expect? Maybe we should turn our focuses to those. And Anne, I don't know if you can kick us off with what you think it is.
My answer is going to be a very short one. Grey listing is effectively creating a difficult environment to do business with South Africa. So the cost of doing business with South Africa goes up, both from an investment perspective and from an investor perspective.
Yeah, and I think what we need to remind ourselves is that grey listing it's not a blacklist, right? I think we need to remember that what happened is the Financial Action Task Force had what they call a mutual evaluation on South Africa, and then what they came up with, FATF comes up with 40 recommendations on all the member states that are part of FATF, and South Africa is one. And those recommendations are, what one should do in terms of from an anti-money laundering, counter-terrorist financing perspective. So we came short on some of those. There's various deficiencies. So what grey listing actually means is that we are now on the monitoring list. We are still a cooperating member as opposed to other blacklisted countries that are completely not cooperating with FATF. So as Anne says, that makes business difficult for us. And I think we'll speak about some of those challenges a bit later.
If I could just add, it's got a macro and micro impact. And so just taking it from I'll use this one. If you take the micro effect, and particularly in mining projects, the ability to raise capital might be further strained, particularly in certain resources, and then the cost of that capital to operate. So, when you're in the exploration environment and trying to get projects to market, it's just potentially going to impact more on that. Cost of capital is going to impact on your cost from an income statement perspective. And I think that's the bigger impact it will have. How does it look from an investor perspective? Well, in actual fact, it might be an advantage to some investors if they've got the risk appetite, because you might get some very good resources at better prices. So, you always look at the negatives of it, and sure, there's quite a lot of negatives, and potentially they've been priced into the market already. and there's always some positives to it. So it'll be interesting times if we do find that we get grey listed.
I suppose we're in the fortunate position that we had one of our neighbours, Mauritius, grey listed not too long ago, and they were able to get off that list quite quickly. Jason, could you maybe give us an idea of what happened when Mauritius was grey listed, and from a day-to-day on the ground point of view, but also from a sort of larger business point of view? Were there a lot of redomiciles? Was there a big capital outflow? What was the experience on the ground?
Yeah, so we just start from the beginning as to what it means to be grey listed. So effectively what Michael has said is that the country is recognized as having compliance issues, but has committed to address these strategic inadequacies and within a specific time frame. So effectively, there are deficiencies. The country has committed to address those issues within a time frame. So this is effectively what is grey listing, and it is extremely important that so as far as grey listing also means, it has other consequences. And for us, the main adverse consequence was that we were put on the European Commission blacklist, which means on the 7th of May 2020, the European Commission adopted a regulation whereby it uses the FATF grey list as its base case to put the country on the blacklist, on their blacklist. And the impact of this is twofold. Obviously, in respect of there is an enhanced due diligence required for all European transfers of monies and so on, all transfers of money coming from Europe, well, any transaction effectively involving a European person and a person based in the country who's grey listed. So that's number one. And number two, the second consequence for us, was the main issue, was that EU funds, i.e. funds coming from the EU Commission, belonging to the EU Commission, cannot be used to transit through that country into an investment elsewhere on the continent. So take a mining company, for instance, which has amongst its investors EIB, for instance, right, European Investment Bank, and that mining company would then invest in, say, in Botswana or another African country. Well, and if there has been a commitment, but the commitment would not be renewed because there's a prohibition upon that being made. Now, in the context of Mauritius, we have a lot of private equity funds based domiciled in Mauritius, and getting number of them receiving funds from the European Investment Bank and other European DFIs. Now, that would mean, especially for the European Investment Bank, that they would not honor, or they would not be able to honor their commitments in terms of capital calls, which would be forthcoming. So what it meant that any funds which was in the process of being incorporated in Mauritius, with having as investor one of the DFIs and so on, given the uncertainty, they were not incorporated in Mauritius and incorporated in other countries such as Luxembourg or Amsterdam and that obviously caused us to lose a significant amount of business in terms of funds being incorporated in other jurisdictions other than Mauritius.
To take Jason's point forward, Jason, if there's a mining opportunity in South Africa, my understanding of what you said, if it's European funds,
Yes.
there could be either the funds aren't available, or it sounds like they weren't made available because they're blacklisted. So, normally you get project funding for projects rather than only the country risk, but it's got an impact. So it could have a lesser effect on South Africa from that perspective, because there's obviously a lot of other jurisdictions, but it eliminates one whole part of your market, which we know is quite close, particularly if it's a UK or a European listing of a company that's operating in South Africa. And I expect we haven't sufficiently considered that listing and funds coming from a jurisdiction in Europe through a listing into South Africa, and whether that had an impact on Mauritius. I would expect it would also have an impact.
Yes, so if the project, for instance, is within South Africa itself, and the money is coming from Europe, that would not have an impact, because the physical location of the project
Is in SA.
Is in SA. However, if the money is coming to SA for investments in a third country, for instance, right, then you will have an issue. And this is where and obviously one of the issues which is the uncertainty it creates, and with all sorts of obviously the ESG rules developing and so on and so forth, would the investors be willing to invest in this structure? Will it cause them difficulties and so on and so forth? All of that, it does cause uncertainties, and which obviously would be better to get rid of those uncertainties and get off the grey list.
And Jason, you're right. So just to add one more point, I mean, let's remember that South Africa is still technically junk status.
Yes.
And I don't think we've had too much of an effect on that. And I think Europeans are still investing and so forth. So it could be a potential other negative. But we are in a junk status. So having another element, putting a negative on the reputation of the country, what's the impact? Yeah.
So the risk of significant further disruptions when we can't really afford it. Businesses are already fighting load shedding, big weather changes, and labor disputes. Michael, what has been done by government, and is it enough to stop a grey listing?
Look, since we've been placed on this monitoring list, there has been quite a lot of work that's been done by government, led by National Treasury. Perhaps the most important is the changes to respective legislation. We've got the new omnibus bill that's under consideration at the moment. And what that does, it looks at different pieces of legislation that there's an impact on anti-money laundering and terrorist financing, and has made certain changes to those. So for example, with the FICA Act, they've changed the definition of accountable institution. We all know that that's accountable institutions have the most onerous obligations in terms of reporting and compliance under FICA. So they've extended that to include credit providers, to include crypto asset providers, as well as any dealers of valuable goods over 100,000 Rand, for example. So that's important, because I think the focus is always on financial institutions. And I think even with Mauritius, you saw that a lot of the deficiencies related to non-financial institutions, right? So I think that's an important development, as well as changing the Companies Act, Trust Property Control Act. And most of those changes related to widening the definition of ultimate beneficial owner. And likewise, like what we saw in Mauritius, that is where a lot of potential gaps lie in identifying the ultimate beneficial owner. So we welcome those changes. Obviously, there are some challenges. For example, within our Trust Property Control Act, our laws of trust, Trust Property Control Act regulations might be different from other regulations where, particularly in a bewine trust as an example, you don't necessarily want the ultimate beneficiary to be disclosed too early because it's your own estate planning purposes for, as an example. But legislation is one thing, right? The government, we saw we had a function, or rather a discussion similar to this at Webo Wenso, where we had the head of Special Investigations Unit that's responsible for investigating state capture and other corruption schemes. And she really gave us a lot of comfort in terms of the steps that they've taken, particularly around enforcement, because that is really the big thing. You can change legislation, but enforcement is the next steps that can take a year or 2 or 3 before you can actually start to evidence that the enforcement agencies have teeth. So she went through what they've done, and quite commendable, but I think she was also at pains and very brutal with us as the private sector to say, look, as much as you can point fingers at us as the prosecuting authorities, it's up to you as a private industry to set up the right structures, to hold all your clients honest, and not to participate in this. So there's a lot of work still to do, and I think it's a collaborative effort between the state as well as the private sector as well.
Thanks, Michael. And from our learnings from Mauritius and what Michael said, a lot of this comes from the enforcement. These new acts have been placed in quite recently, and we probably haven't had enough time to enforce them fully. So there is a greater risk of South Africa being placed on that list. What do you think the implications would be from a fund's point of view and the ability to attract investments into South Africa?
Maybe as South Africans, we are plagued by always needing to see the positive because there's just so much negative around us. But I think it's important to not paint a picture of Armageddon. We, as Bert said, are already junk rated. So the enhanced due diligence process from our current credit status to the grey listing status is not actually going to change the ability to raise capital. But what is going to change is the costs of compliance. All of us in corporates now require far bigger compliance teams. I mean, the cost of resourcing in those areas is growing dramatically. Transaction times will be extended. Opening accounts in other jurisdictions just takes much longer going forward, and grey listing is only going to further increase those timelines. So it's effectively you've just got to be a little bit more patient if you're trying to do business in South Africa going forward. But the corporates also understand the implications. So I am of the view that the public-private partnership will work. Corporates are coming to the party. We understand the need to be FCC compliant. Make sure that your money laundering processes and policies are in place. I'm convinced that we will all come to the party with that. Counter-terrorism financing, there's so many rules and regulations, but as Michael said, if the corporates don't play their part, then none of it is going to work. You can put out as many rules as you really need to. I mean, we all still get the call center phone calls, whether Poppy is enacted or not, right? So we've actually just got to play our part.
Yeah. If I can add quickly, put it this way, if it ends up that we are not ultimately grey listed, would it really change anything from the perspective that all the compliance requirements that we are being requested to have in place now should surely still remain, right? If you don't have a risk management compliance plan, you don't have a sanctions policy, you don't have policies around bribery and anti-corruption, so all of those things need to be in place either way, because even if we're not grey listed, if we neglect all of those, sooner or later, FATF will be knocking on the door in any event. So I think the lesson is, let's just get our houses in order across the board. Yeah.
But probably the same question to you, more specifically on South African mining companies and their day-to-day operations. What do you see the effect being on them?
Richard, thanks. I mentioned early on, from a access to capital and then also cost of capital. That's where the impact will be. But there's many ways of funding mining operations, exploration rights. to an extent. Maybe funding's also moved on. There's a lot of private VCs. So the impact of that might be following those channels. Normally it's the banking channels that you'll have more impact. And you don't get projects normally funded on banking. Normally it's the operations of it that's funded on banking, but not so much the exploration phase. So it's still difficult to quantify where all the impacts are going to be, because things like this have got an interesting way. You pass or you get affected by it, but you still, how would the rest of the world see it, and how will a particular institution or institutions see it outside of the world, and outside of South Africa? So you've got to, you don't know, but I don't believe the effect is going to be that there's no capital. I believe the effect is going to be there's going to be capital available, but at what cost? And as I said, it could be actually an opportunity, if you're a risk taker, to get some very good projects at good prices. So it could have that spin-off.
Okay, thanks, Bert. Michael, from your point of view, have you seen any real impacts on deals currently being structured and negotiated in South Africa, either on the pricing or on the terms of the deals?
We are not seeing too many changes yet in terms of structure. I mean, the structures are tried and tested. So if you look on the private equity side, for example, the partnership structure will remain, is the most tax efficient, most flow through, and protects the liability of the investors. So what we are seeing is a lot more discussion around possibly setting up parallel vehicles. So having a South African structure together with another vehicle in another jurisdiction to sort of counter the possible effects, and perhaps to make sure that investments in certain jurisdictions, if we end up being grey listed, are then invested not directly through South Africa. But we are already in much the same way from an investment and pricing perspective. We're seeing that some of it has been priced in. We are seeing negotiations have been taken into account already. So what you might see is investors looking for negotiating more stronger terms around excused rights. So a DFI might say, for example, that yes, we are participating in your structure, but when it comes to investing directly through South Africa, we've got the right to be excused from those particular investments. So then they participate in everything else other than that. And then, of course, there'll be a lot more representations and warranties around what you're actually doing in terms of countering money laundering. Are you actually going through the designated listings around the UN lists to identify sanctioned individuals? Are you looking at the OFAC lists? And what do you do if your counterparty is found to be a sanctioned individual? So there'll be those representations and warranties and particular indemnities, and giving the investor the option to structure things differently should you ultimately be found to be dealing with such counterparties.
Okay. Sarah, so I guess in the world of ESG, is particularly on the environmental and social side, there's always been an alignment with best practice, and it sounds like that's how we're going to have to move now on the governance side as well, where perhaps the laws of the country might be there but haven't been implemented correctly. How have you dealt with this on the other side of the ESG acronym?
Thanks, Richard. So I think ESG, is always, first way it sort of came to being was being understood as a risk tool, and how it can help you manage risk. In terms of, poor governance or stuff, when you think about creating a policy, one of the things we always work to put in is to say, well, where country laws are weak, non-existent, or not implemented well, then you will seek to follow and align with best practice, because that helps to negate some of those other issues. And I think with a potential grey listing, if you put that in, that's where the big corporates might already be ahead, or that's how you can help to manage some of that as well.
Okay, and I guess how would you demonstrate that? That would probably be through some sort of reporting mechanism and perhaps some assurance work, saying, well, this is what we do, getting guys like BDO in to come and
That's one of the reasons, the reporting and disclosure frameworks are developing as they are, because people are very alive to greenwashing, and it's very easy to say, yes, we do this, this, and this. So actually now you need to show and have that assurance aspect in there as well.
I also think best practice, is an interesting term, because often it misses a country-specific lens. If you are talking best practice from a European perspective, best practice around ESG is now all about climate change and climate disclosures. Best practice from a South Africa lens cannot ignore the fact that we have got a heavy resource-based economy. We have got over 30% unemployment. There is no way we are in the position to consider what we do in shutting down huge contributors to our economy in this just transition discussion. So, it's important for us as South African companies to not almost be consumed by the European lens, because we will effectively annihilate critical parts of our economy if we do that.
And I think you've touched on the just transition, and I want to come back to that just now, but using your words, being South Africans and being eternal optimists, maybe we need to look at Mauritius and check with Jason what did Mauritius do to get off that list so quickly. I know it was a joint effort from both government and business, but what worked, and how did you get off that quickly?
Yeah. So in September 2018, we were compliant with only 14 of the 40 FATF recommendations. And in September 2022, we were compliant with 40 out of 40. So obviously, to move from 14 to 40, there's been a lot of work which has been undertaken. And so the first of all, what the government did was obviously immediately they brought in substantial improvements to the MAL CFT framework, changes to the financial intelligence and anti-money laundering regulation to address FATF requirements regarding customer due diligence, politically exposed persons, corresponding banking, money or value transfer services, and so on. So a number of issues there. Then there were some follow-up reports, and we were found to be largely compliant on 35 of the 40 recommendations. So there were effectively 5 remaining outstanding actions, which we needed to comply with, and these were the most difficult ones, because it included demonstrating that the supervisors of its global business sector and designated non-financial business and professional implemented a risk-based supervision. So to be able to do that, for instance, we know a number of management companies with which we deal with employed or got the services of various professional companies such as BDO and so on, even ourselves as lawyers, to do audits and to ensure that, to demonstrate that business was compliant. Now, that had the advantage as well, because when the regulator came in, obviously you were able to demonstrate up front that you had done what you needed to do to be compliant with all the regulations, all the rules, and so on. So that was greatly helpful, and it was helpful in the way that it stopped you from getting into issues with the regulator, because it's already shown that you've done what you needed to do to implement those rules. And effectively, at that moment in time, the regulator is looking for people who have shortcomings to be able to take action against them, to demonstrate that them as regulators are indeed taking action against those who have shortcomings. So it's quite important to take a proactive action on that basis. The second issue was regulation, the accurate access to accurate basic information on beneficial ownership, which was important by the competent authorities. The other, which was a bit more, this is, I touched on that early on, was demonstrating that law enforcement and agencies have capacity to conduct money laundering investigation, including parallel financial investigations and complex cases. So effectively, that would mean what I just said early on, them demonstrating that they are investigating and taking action against those who have shortcoming. Now, this is the issue with showing this, is that you have it sort of backward looking, because you have to build a track record, so to speak, and that's the most difficult one to put in place. Another one was implementing a risk-based approach for supervision of its non-for-profit sector. So what we did was the number of actions were taken. So risk-based surveillance, the FSC, Financial Services Commission, carried on a number, more than 100 on-site inspections, guideline principles for casinos, and were issued, sort of outreach programs, training for lawyers, and by the Attorney General's office. All the real estate sector had got to be regulated and trained, and so on. So it was very much an effort, and obviously the task force, government task force, was presided by the Prime Minister himself. So high, obviously, political commitment, and from government, and also from the private sector, to ensure that we were able to implement all these recommendations quickly and effectively.
Okay.
Jason makes reference to obviously coming out of a grey listing.
Yeah.
We haven't yet been grey listed. No. So we've got some forecast probabilities of the chances of us being grey listed. I understand yesterday Business Day was carrying a 60%. I've read an article, Illidex, the research house, is saying 85% chance of being grey listed. But I think the urgency that we, the government in South Africa, must probably initially, and I'd like to actually get Michael's viewpoint on this, but if you talk to the general person in the street, grey listing, they look at you and what is it? That's my understanding. Most people actually don't see the impact of it. When you talk to more corporates, financing and finance houses, then it starts becoming a bigger conversation. And so the urgency of us maybe adopting processes, procedures, and mitigating factors to it have been slow, but a lot has been done. We had an extension, so I'm still, hope isn't a strategy, but I'm hopeful that we will hopefully avoid it. That 60% hopefully will ratchet down. But Michael's stressed and stressed that unless you can evidence compliance, and we're not going to be able to evidence much compliance in February, and I think they've only extended it until February, so that's my only concern, is are we going to avoid it? But we've done a lot. So to your point, Jason, we've done a lot to sort of follow the Mauritian model. We just might not be able to prove it quickly enough to avoid it.
Yeah. As Bert's saying, it is an urgent situation. Michael, I think you said earlier that this is being driven by National Treasury. Is that the right department, and how do you feel they're doing?
I think it's the right department, obviously working closely with everyone else involved, the Director of Public Prosecutions, all the supervisory bodies such as the Financial Intelligence Center, and even the other supervisory bodies, whether the law societies, the Financial Services Conduct Authority, and everyone else. And then obviously bringing in the private sector. And I think if I've got one word to summarize how this should be done, and I think Jason from a Mauritius perspective will back that, it is dialogue, right? Dialogue and commitment. And it has to be with all those parties really working together to see, what can we do to get off the list? Because the challenge is the fact that we've only got so much time. Yes, we can show commitment now, we can show what we've done, we can show, I was reading just yesterday that there's a new bill that's been put in place to try and put in place measures to ensure that the Director of Public Prosecutions is more independent, right? I don't know to what extent, but obviously they're doing that as a response to this. The question now becomes, to what extent can we have conversations, real and genuine conversations with OFAC as to what we haven't managed to achieve, but that we're still working towards in order to get off this, to not be placed on the grey list. And equally as a private sector, I think the dialogue is between our investors, entities such as management companies that set up entities for us, the administrators and everyone, to say, well, how can we work together to make sure that we are compliant and we do what needs to be done.
Yeah, sorry, just to add, so what I gather is that you got until February to address those strategic deficiencies which you have.
Unless we get another extension.
And unless you get another extension, in which time. But I suppose that a number of the strategic deficiencies, obviously you know what they are,
We do.
and they've been addressed. Is it in a collaborative manner between government or with government and private sector acting in concert, or each one doing their own thing?
I think there's reasonable collaboration, but certainly more can be done. We had the additional challenges of the fact that, this risk-based methodology, for example, or to KYC is not a new thing, but in terms of actually changing the legislation, there's a consultative process that normally takes place. We had COVID and we lost a whole 2 years in terms of consultation. So not defending the government, but I feel that also put us back a little bit, and I feel that there is a lot of pressure, or at least an intentional commitment to collaborate a lot more. All the changes that I spoke about from a Companies Act perspective and so forth is stuff that's been under consultation and processes have been ongoing, but it's just that we need to find ways of doing it quicker, and perhaps of also consulting more widely other than what we've been doing up until now.
Do you know, if I can just add to that, I think the one risk that we haven't possibly highlighted is that at some point the cost of compliance becomes so exorbitant for small businesses in particular that it doesn't justify setting up the business in South Africa. And I think that will have far more adverse consequences than, capital raising and things like that, because just the risk-based methodology, to have to risk rate every single individual client that you onboard is far more onerous than the old KYC process that we'd all become familiar with. In a high risk rating situation, you have to then re-risk rate that client every year or every 6 months. All of that requires resources, it requires people on the ground, and when the margins are too thin in any business, sometimes it's just not worth it any longer.
So maybe if I can make an accounting joke, Bert, do we add an extra C onto WACC, weighted average cost of capital and compliance? And
It's a very good question there. I like that extra C on the WACC. But it's actually a worldwide phenomenon, but it makes a very good point. Compliance, if you look at our profession, and it's a highly regulated profession, You've got to look at it. You want regulation. If you're an airline company, as the public, you want regulation. You want to make sure that, there's regulation to the airlines. But when does compliance become too onerous to comply with? When the UK went through this in compliance, particularly in the financial services, Barclays at the time, and this must have been about 10 years ago, employed the person that was running, the head of regulations. And as I recall it, that person, when they joined Barclays, lasted 6 months. It was too difficult to comply. And those are the regulations they've been putting in place. So it's actually quite a challenge, but it's a challenge we're all actually experiencing. And this could be an added component. But just to take the step back, I mean, South Africans are very good at passing regulation. We're not always very good at enforcing regulation and the follow-through. I mean, I think has been touched on. And that is the only concern. And also the awareness. I mean, there's a couple of newspaper articles on this and that, but the general awareness actually is quite low. As I was saying earlier on, it's quite low to the impact this is going to have on many, many organizations. Even if we avoid, I mean, I'm hoping we can avoid it, but we've got to comply to avoid it. So there's going to be a huge amount of additional compliance coming our way, whether we like it or not.
Thanks, panelists. We've got a few more minutes where we'll take some questions, but I guess the first one comes back walking around the Indaba and one-to-one over the past few days. One of the things being hotly debated is the just energy transition. Over the last 2 or 3 COPs, we've seen a substantial amount of money committed to South Africa for this transition, and this money, would it be affected by a grey listing? I suppose is a question that would come up. I don't know if there's anyone brave enough to...
Who's giving the money?
I mean, I think with will it be affected? Grey listing is unlike lockdown, where they told you the night before that you're not going anywhere tomorrow, right? So this has been a long discussion lead time. So any implications have already factored in the fact that if we are grey listed, will this still happen or not? So the COP discussions that happened a few months ago would have not factored in the fact that South Africa has a very high probability of grey listing. Yes, it simply means that the requirements for the funding get a little bit tighter. The evidencing of proof of disbursement of assets to the right place become a little bit more onerous. But does it mean that the money doesn't come? I'm not of that view.
Great, thank you. I think on that we're going to open up to questions, if there are any. Yes. Sorry, if you just wait a second, we'll bring a mic round.
You asked the question I was going to ask, and certainly there's a flood of investments coming from the Nordic countries to our country for a variety of reasons. I think because we're semi-developed and also a developing country, I think there's opportunity to make things happen here. Some of the monies are coming from non-EU countries. So does the panel know how fussy they are about grey listing? But basically my question's identical to yours, sir. And I ask lots of questions, so I think take the microphone away quickly.
I think exactly that's what Jason was asking. Where's the money coming from? Because each person...
So what we've seen as far as Mauritius is concerned, so the leader as far as the DFIs is concerned is the EIB. And the other DFIs tend to follow what EIB does to a certain extent. And if the money is coming, say, from no fund and so on, then it is very possible that they would, obviously, because generally the DFIs generally invest together, and so it is very possible that the Nordic countries follow what the European Union is doing, or what EIB as a DFI is doing. So there is a risk there. but that may be the case. Now, as far as Mauritius was concerned, given the reassurances which the government gave and the speed with which reform was being brought through, they were able to reassure a number of the DFIs, European and Nordic country DFIs, that to carry on investing into funds in Mauritius, so as not to disrupt the financial services sector. So that they've been able to do that. Though also what you're saying is we're talking about investments directly into the country as opposed to transitioning through South Africa. So that also is an important difference.
Yeah, if I could just add to that, I mean, your question's great because it now talks to a very specific part of the sector, of the economy. And the most Nordic countries that I'm aware of, and I might be wrong, have been investing in our renewables. And I mean, I expect energy and our energy crunch hasn't really come into this conversation. So as I say, when you take that point further, is it the project that's more important and whether it gets blacklisted or not from a Nordic perspective, a European perspective, and those funds would have to come from elsewhere. Having been involved with renewable companies, looking for funding, they like to look at the Nordic countries. Is there a significant appetite, knowledge that comes from them to our environment as renewable? So, correct. As I say, a lot of knowledge. So, yeah, it would be I would think it would be quite a negative if we get a blacklisting from a European perspective. We don't need those in our energy environment.
I think from an ESG perspective, the Nords definitely lead the way. So if you take someone like Norge, the Norwegian pension fund, their exclusion list gets rolled out to a lot of the asset managers. So, you know, they've been looking at a lot of the stuff for a long time and really driving the narrative.
Donnie, I think there's a question in front.
Thank you. My question is really a broad one. We know that South Africa, one of the biggest challenges that we face as a country, but we don't really talk about it anymore, is the lack of transformation on all sectors of our society, including business, including the business we all down here for mining. So that lack of transformation, what is this grey listing going to have in terms of ability to raise funds, ability to sustain the transformation that's already there, and ability to do the work around existing mining communities, and ability for projects, and lastly, how do you then bring in the angle of the just energy transactions and transformation? What happens, because it's not just about the jobs that are going to be left or the people that are going to be repurposed. What do you do with those masses and masses of people and the livelihoods and lives that will be impacted? If I can hear from all the panelists, please, if possible, sorry.
I'm happy to give it a start. You know, transformation, I mean, from our perspective, it's still, you mentioned it's not highly spoken about. I mean, it is quite highly spoken about for various reasons, whether for positive or negative reasons. But yeah, the success of transformation is always a lot easier in a growing economy, to your point. And I mean, what we're talking about is it could have the aspects of shrinking the economy further, which we don't need. So it's all elements of being negative to the economy could be negative to transformation. So to your question, yes, I do see that it could be a negative to the whole journey of the continuance of the transformation, the ability to open up parts of the economy to wider participation by all. I mean, from a skills perspective, I can't see this being of any benefit because you need funding to open up companies, businesses, mining, renewables. You know, when you start talking about all this, it's not going to be positive. So we definitely need to, and maybe that actually should be something that should be more widely communicated, of the impact of something small like this, potentially. You know, people might see it as small. It's not small, but grey listing would have a significant impact right through the fibre of South Africa.
Yeah, if I can comment as well, just from a private equity perspective, from a capital raising perspective, what I'm hoping to see and what I think is likely to happen. I mean, we saw during COVID, a lot of funds were really affected. They couldn't raise capital in the time period that they wanted, and the commitment periods were longer. It was hard to sweat the assets. But the DFIs actually came to the party in a big way. They really propped up the private equity industry and kept us afloat up to a stage now where we're coming out of it and there's some dry powder on the table. And I feel the same thing potentially can happen at this point in time. It is in the interest of all the DFIs and investors that have taken a position and said, we want to invest in impactful industries, that contribute to transformation, that contribute to all the pillars of ESG. And I feel they'll probably be looking for ways to come to the party and make sure that we can close that gap despite the potential of grey listing.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's a very valid question, which is, it goes to the point I made earlier around making sure that best practice is best for the country in which you are based, right? We cannot possibly have the same urgencies in South Africa as Germany has, for example. So we have to always keep in mind the context where we are. So South Africa has still got a huge backlog when it comes to effecting transformation. But Bert is right, transformation works best in a growing economy, but it should not then be the excuse to not effect transformation. And it's a bit like saying, but there's no skill set. There is the people there, find the people, but make sure that the policies work for the needs of the economy. So in the just energy transition, the political will, the rules and the regulations must factor in the need to continue to effect transformation. So when we do the skills transfer, let us make sure that the rules specify that we are transferring skills to the right communities. Make sure that rehabilitation of those mining communities are factored in and considered in just transition. There's got to be a huge South African focus when it comes to this. Otherwise, the transformation element is just going to fall completely flat.
From my perspective, I think within the mining sector, it's had a battle to win hearts and minds of younger generations, and so you've got your mining associations and industry bodies actually saying, well, no, we are an industry that's critical to like a post-2030 development agenda. And so they're really starting to focus on that narrative of how mining can have a really positive socio-economic effect, and you'll see a lot of work happening there. And I think that will help to drive and negate some of those impacts you're talking about.
Great. I think we've got time for one last question, if there is one from the floor. Please.
Thanks. My question pertains to other jurisdictions that recently got into the grey list. I know, Jason, you spoke about Mauritius and the fact that you guys got off quite remarkably after 2 years. But I'm not sure if everyone's aware that Dubai has also recently been placed on that grey list. And I'm not sure if anybody can speak to what, the implications there are. One of the panelists mentioned the fact that we didn't meet the FATF's requirements. One of them was, I think, our failure to enforce our anti-corruption laws and also prosecute corruption. So just perhaps a comment from the panel on, a jurisdiction like Dubai, for example.
Yeah, Dubai has come on the list recently, and I know that we are taking it seriously. We are making a number of changes. Though it would appear that they haven't really been badly affected by the grey listing, given their strong position. Though they are taking measures, there's the introduction of the of taxes and so there's also changes in respect of beneficial ownerships of the companies which we're putting in place. So there's a number of issues we have to bring, but so I don't know when they're focusing to be off the list. Other countries, obviously, is Botswana, which came on the list at the same time as we did, actually, and has already come off the list. There's Ghana, which came on the list around the same time as we did, and also they are now off the list. So there's some talk. I think Nigeria got on the list. So yes, there's a lot of people. There's a lot of countries there's a lot of movement on coming on and off the list. But Botswana and Ghana are very good examples of countries which have come on the list at the same time as we did, and it was during COVID actually, and we all of us managed to put in the necessary reforms to get off the list. It's a question of political will at the end.
Great. Thank you, Jason. I think that's a good summary there. It's a political will and hard work by business to implement. We didn't get to the questions online, but we'll try and post some answers to those on these videos. We just want to thank the panelists for coming through and spending some time with us, and then also thank our audience here in Cape Town and online on the various social media platforms. There will be some time after this to get to meet with the panelists out in front. So thank you very much for coming through.
Thank you.